He is known as the painter of young dancers, the wings of the opera, and horse races. Edgar Degas found his inspiration in the ordinary, daily, and sometimes trivial lives of his contemporaries. An artist with a sharp mind and brutal spoken words, he disdained honor and glory. Ironically, today he is one of the giants of Impressionism, and his paintings sell for millions of euros.
The most important thing that he said, I think that really gives an insight into his life, is he said, "I'd like to be famous and unknown."
The history of art was more unfair to the American Mary Cassatt. While a star in the United States, she has remained mostly unknown in France, though she was a major figure in the Impressionist movement. Her only fault was being a female painter at a time when art was still a man's world.
She has never been given the recognition that she deserves.
And yet the two enjoyed a rare friendship for close to 30 years, a surprising friendship that few knew about. Not the type of friendship linking a professor and student, as has often been said. It was a deep and sincere friendship between two colleagues, Mary Cassatt, the feminist, and Edgar Degas, the misogynist. The two had strong personalities and were demanding artists who devoted their lives to their painting. They were the source of one of the most beautiful dialogues in the history of art.
You really can't talk about one without talking about the other. That's how big of an influence they had on each other.
Few French people know her name, even fewer her work. Yet she was the ambassador of the Impressionist movement. Without Mary Cassatt, the painters who can continue to shake up the art market today, Renoir, Monet, and Degas, would have continued to sell their work while still alive for very little money.
Mary
Cassatt brought recognition to the Impressionists. She helped sell their paintings in the United States. Very simply, she brought them recognition in France. She did so much for them, but has never been given enough credit.
Mary Cassatt did everything for the Impressionists. She opened up doors for them to be seen. She was the first to introduce Impressionism in the United States, in fact, with a painting by Edgar Degas. From that point, the Americans bought a great number of canvases, which is why the most beautiful Impressionist paintings are now in the United States.
Of all the Impressionists, Degas was her favorite. She loved the strength of his designs and his unique way of revealing the psychology of his subjects by his composition. Mary Cassatt saw him as the successor to the major classics. She persuaded her collector friend, Louisine Havemeyer, to acquire this pastel of soft colors of a ballet practice. In 1877, Edgar Degas became the first Impressionist artist to sell in the United States.
Louisine Havemeyer, for example, the first time she got one of the pictures, she said, "I'm uncomfortable, I'm very confused with it, there's a lot of movement and action, explain this to me." And Mary Cassatt spent some time explaining the work of Edgar Degas. So I'm not sure that he would be as well known in the US if it wasn't for the efforts of Mary Cassatt.
Degas had begun his career as an academic artist, strongly influenced by the painter Ingres. Then he met Manet, Monet, and Renoir at the Café Gerbois. Their heated discussions on painting convinced him to find his subjects all around him in the tumult of Parisian life. In 1877, Degas was making the sharp turn towards more modern work. Mary Cassatt was one of the very few people who admired this new style. He chose bold composition and gave his work the impression of being a snapshot, what he liked in photography.
Especially through his work depicting racetracks, Degas presented scenes in an original style, something like he would do with dances. Generally, he did not depict the race, but more often the moments of relaxation away from the track or the race. He was looking to capture the atmosphere more than to transcribe the sport activity. And that in itself was original, obviously.
C'est original, évidemment.
It was in this key period in Degas' career that Mary Cassatt met him. She had arrived in France 10 years earlier, at no more than age 21. She had just completed her training as a painter by taking private classes and copying the old-school masters. But it was her meeting with Edgar Degas, 10 years her senior, that would determine the path she would take.
Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas finally met after seeing each other's work.
Edgar Degas was visiting the Academy showroom in 1874 with his friend Léon Auguste Tourny. He stopped in front of a painting.
It consisted of large brushstrokes and so looked like a preliminary draft, which was different from the other work at the show. Looking at the canvas, Degas is supposed to have said,
"This is someone who feels what I feel." And Tourny told him, "It was done by Mary Cassatt. I know her."
I think he saw a personality coming out of her work. Although it was common, it had style, but it interpreted some kind of a gesture or gaze that caught his attention.
And there was more, though that was perhaps the nicest aspect of their eventual meeting. Mary Cassatt was in Paris, and with her friend Lizine, they stopped in front of a show window on Boulevard Haussmann. She saw two paintings, one of a ballet practice, and the other, horses at the Longchamp racetrack.
Years later, she would say, "I often went and flattened my nose against that window to absorb as much as I could of his art. It would change my life."
So what better way to meet each other than by their respective paintings?
And 3 years went by before they really met.
It was 1877, and the selection for the official salon was announced. Mary Cassatt was furious. For the third time, she had been refused. It was then that Tourny introduced her to Degas. He had already revolted against the tyranny of the overly academic jury. With Monet, Pissarro, Sisley, Renoir, and others, he had organized a group that exhibited their new style of painting. Degas immediately asked Mary Cassatt to join them.
She was thrilled because she had admired the work of Edgar Degas, knew that it was the style of art that she was working towards. Edgar Degas was anxious to recruit her. He said to her, "Most women paint as though they're trimming hats, but not you. Your work is unique." And so she appreciated that she was recognized for that. And she gladly accepted his offer to exhibit with this group of artists who were creating a climate of revolt against art, classical art, academic art.
The troublemakers sought to get around the domination of the official salon, which at the time was the only means to achieve any recognition.
You must remember that at the time, the art salons were still full of history-style paintings. This was the dominant style, with nudes resembling nymphs and goddesses.
It was also the age of revolution in painting. Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet shook things up. Academic shows in which juries had been deciding for the past 200 years the winners and losers were rejected.
So they wanted to create their own independent exhibition, an alternative system that was not juried, and they wanted to choose the artists themselves, determine how many pieces of artwork can go into these exhibits.
And Edgar Degas was involved with Monet and Pissarro, though not quite in the beginning, in the real struggle to establish a salon of modern painters. In 1874, the famous show was held, that they called the Salon of the Independents. Others called it the Impressionist Salon.
Joining these anti-establishment figures when she was beginning to paint demonstrates Mary Cassatt's strong character. Already, there was little room for female artists. What more, she was a somewhat isolated foreigner. But as she began her career, she was quick to turn her back on the official salon and to join Degas.
Although there were 3,500 people that attended their first exhibition, many of the people who attended used their canes and their umbrellas to destroy the work and to criticize the work. But Mary Cassatt saw that as a challenge, to be with this new group of artists who were doing something different, and she thought it would be a way for her to be recognized, separate from the common artists that were being accepted into the salon.
Exhibiting with the Impressionists was very liberating for Mary Cassatt.
At last I could work in total freedom, without worrying about the opinions of the jury. I had already understood who were the real artistic masters. I admired Manet, Courbet, and Degas, and I hated conventional art. I was beginning to live my life.
2 years went by before Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas exhibited together during the 4th Impressionist Salon. But during that time, the two artists got to know each other. They went together to the Louvre, to fashion outlets, the opera, and to dinners with friends. They had similar sharp minds, liked to discuss artistic technique, and roamed around looking for paintings of Parisian lifestyles.
They got together almost every day, especially given that they lived close to each other in Montmartre. He accompanied her to her fashion designer and to the hairdresser. They lived as very close friends.
Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt were really a team. Those who spent time with them said they understood each other without speaking, by smiling. This knowing and implicit understanding left others to the side. They were truly a duo.
A journalist said they were colleagues in independence, sharing passion and conviction. Their mutual admiration nourished their artistic complicity and their friendship.
However, their different temperaments complemented each other. He was a cynic. She had a good nature and optimism, so they balanced each other off.
Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt argued constantly. They got angry and then reconciled. Once Miss Cassatt confided in me, "My dear, he's awful. He destroys your willpower. How can you both get along?" I asked her to provoke her to tell me more. "Oh," she answered, "I'm independent. I can live alone and I like to work. Sometimes he's furious not to find cracks in my armor, and we spend months without seeing each other."
Edgar Degas was known for his bad temper, his intransigence, and his sarcasm, mostly directed at other artists. He was rude and wanted to keep people at a distance so as not to risk being distracted in his work.
He reserved thorough and cruel language for painters he didn't like, and he didn't like any except Ingres. In the art world, his words were rightly considered to be deadly. For example, speaking about paintings by Carrière, he used striking and severe language. "They look like brains with black butter," he said.
He said, I went to visit Monet painting water lilies, and I said, let me get out of here. Those reflections hurt my eyes. They make me dizzy. I should turn up my collar because it feels drafty in here. He didn't have any hesitation with criticizing Monet's work.
Marie Cassatt was well armed to ward off his blows. Behind her natural elegance, she had a strong personality, confident, determined, and sharp.
She would have made a poor career as a diplomat because she never held back an opinion. She never cared about what other people thought about her. Her frankness sometimes was a little insulting. And that was a perfect match for Edgar Degas because she could handle him. Nevertheless, they were very close friends. They had this mutual understanding that they could challenge each other, stand up to their forceful personalities. And they had this enduring relationship that undoubtedly made them stronger artists.
Their complicity and strong characters made them free spirits within the Impressionist group. They shared free-stroke styles and their preference for subjects from daily life. But they showed no interest in painting landscapes or seeking the natural light that the others liked so much.
They were different from the Impressionists because Edgar Degas did not like to work outdoors. He liked to work in solitude. He didn't participate in a scene as, for example, Renoir did. When Renoir painted a picture, you could smell the food and hear the music, and you knew that he was part of the scene. Edgar Degas painted a scene as though he was looking through a keyhole. He wanted to create this new style of art, but he wanted to bring it back to his studio, compose his work, make it very specific, not painting a scene as he saw it.
No art is less spontaneous than mine. I know nothing about inspiration, spontaneity, and temperament. The same subject must be redone 10 or 100 times. Nothing in art should appear to be an accident, even the gestures. What I do is the result of thinking and studying the grand masters.
But what's most interesting is the Impressionist artists were criticized for not creating depth in their picture because they never used the color black. Edgar Degas and Marie Cassatt believed in that deep color, and they were able to, although use the light color, still create this depth. They very often used black in their canvases.
And while artistically speaking, they were different from the group, they were fully involved in it.
Edgar Degas became a reluctant leader of the Impressionists, and Marie Cassatt was very influential in that she was able to fund the exhibits and organize the exhibit.
Through their circles of relations, they had access to certain halls to hold exhibits, and they sometimes invested financially in these collective shows.
They were among the wealthiest of the Impressionists. This social status was something else the two artists shared.
Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas had things in common going back to childhood. Both came from conventional upper-middle-class banking families.
Mary Cassatt was protected from financial difficulties for her entire life. Degas experienced a more difficult period when his brother's business went bankrupt.
He would now have to start selling his work to restore his family's name. And that was very difficult for him because he was obliged to part with his work. He was a perfectionist. He was rarely satisfied.
In his workshop at 37 Rue Victor Massé in the Pigalle district, Degas began producing a large number of paintings with fashionable subjects for his dealer Paul Durand-Ruel. It is ironic that his articles, as he called them, are today considered to be his most beautiful canvases. The subjects are his famous dancers, known throughout the world.
Mary Cassatt came from a good family with good support. She was close to her mother, who listened to her and was open to her artistic side. And her father was what he was, yes, a banker with everything that can mean. He liked established order and was not particularly thrilled about the artistic adventures of his daughter.
She told him, "I want to be a painter." And he responded. It was really an awful response. He said to her, "I would rather you die than become a painter." That affected her strongly.
Her move to France was seen as an escape, an opportunity to get away from the oppressive, patriarchal attitudes of the U.S. She once wrote, "Give me France. Women do not have to fight for recognition there. In France, they can be someone and not something." So that says a lot about her personality.
Mary Cassatt was a rebel, but had her obvious contradictions. She would never abandon or condemn her social milieu, but strongly criticized it. She herself rejected many of the codes linked to her upbringing. This emerged in a surprising manner. She did a painting of her cousin with the name Madame Riddle. The painting depicted a woman who was not very nice at all, to say the least.
She presented us with a haughty and violent person for whom we could see she had disdain. We saw this when she drew her hands like the fingers of a spider crab. This was a way for Mary Cassatt to say, "This is not my world. I am not a part of this proper family with its good manners."
Degas found the painting splendid and severe. He identified with this manner of painting that was not flattering. Such a connection between two artists was unusual. It gave us a rare moment in the history of art, and unique for each of the two on their own paths. The two artists worked together on the same painting, The Little Girl in a Blue Chair. Signed by Mary Cassatt, it is the only work painted together by the two friends.
Edgar Degas did not hesitate to bring his touch and his advice, and even to add to the canvas without Cassatt feeling upset about it.
This was the only painting, according to Mary Cassatt, of The Little Girl in a Blue Chair, done with the participation of Edgar Degas. He not only advised her on the horizon lines and the depth of the painting, but he also used his brush to correct and give more depth to this magnificent piece of work.
She had parallel field between the floor and the wall, and Edgar Degas put it at an angle. It wound up being a more dynamic arrangement.
Cassat was positive about Degas working on this painting. She saw it as proof of their healthy artistic rivalry and not as a master correcting the work of his student.
They understood each other. They had a certain affinity. And in any case, it was quite obvious that each respected the other and each admired the work of the other.
They always tried to outdo each other, which was also interesting. And when Mary Cassatt started using metallics to create a shimmer in her paintings, Edgar Degas, although criticized her, put them in his paintings a little later, creating different mediums, accentuating shadows and highlights. So absolutely, she had an influence on him.
More than a real influence, we could call this a passageway between their paintings.
There was certainly a creative dialogue in operation.
They were having fun playing a kind of ping pong through their paintings.
So it's real affinity and contact linked to regular exchanges. That included having clear arguments where one provoked the other. Based on that, the entire artistic dimension was enriched.
Edgar Degas had mentioned that in her depiction of women holding children, very often there was this representation between their heads and their arms and where they're holding the child as this S-curve. And she saw that as a bit of a challenge and continued to do it even more in her canvases. And what's interesting is after this, he implemented the S-curve into his canvases of the women dancers.
The opera dancers, the laundry women ironing, or the singers in cafes were a pretext for him to study movement and composition. He focused on them like a photographer capturing a precise moment.
His compositions are dynamic, they're jarring. He's got unusual viewing angles, lighting, characters that kind of drift in and out of a scene. He challenges you and encourages you to finish the story in a picture. You don't exactly know what's happening, but you're anxious to imagine what happens next.
The notes scribbled in his sketchbook shed precious light on how he worked on composition. Cut a lot. From a dancer, do either the arms or the legs, or the lower back. Do the slippers, the hands of a hairstylist. Bare feet dancing.
Complementing that was the work of Mary Cassatt, who sought to depict the intimacy and the internal world of her subjects.
While Degas could go where he liked, Mary Cassatt was limited by the restrictions on women at the time. She had no access to backstage areas, to orchestra pits, or even to the cafes where other painters met. She found most of her subjects in her social settings, conventional middle-class people reading the paper or drinking tea.
Most of their work focused on indoor settings. The urban ambiance was evoked through social settings such as cafes, and especially concert halls.
Of all these exciting Parisian settings, the opera was the one they shared in life and in their paintings. They attended the opera together several times a month. It was there, with all the existing social conventions, that their artistic dialogue flourished.
Edgar Degas would present the male perspective, and Mary Cassatt would present the female perspective. The male perspective was where you sat in the audience, the fact that you could go behind stage, meet the dancers. Women were not allowed to go backstage. They had to sit in the loge. So Mary Cassatt presented the women at the loge as being the watchers and people who are also being watched. As the viewer, we kind of complete that circle by watching this interaction happening.
Their points of view differed, but the way they painted was so similar that it was at times difficult to distinguish a Degas from a Cassat. It was the case, for example, for this jeune fille arrangeant ses cheveux.
This painting was often misrepresented or mistaken as a Degas, which Mary Cassatt was flattered by the confusion, but somewhere in the end, eventually it was recognized that it was Mary Cassatt's.
One day, both of them were reportedly looking at the work of a colleague when Cassat dared to comment that the work had no style. With a mischievous look, Degas is to have shrugged his shoulders, as if to say, this is what happens when women judge artwork.
So, as a personal challenge, and in response to that, she paints a portrait of an awkward girl tying up her hair, very similar to the women that he painted in these simple poses. And she wanted to show him that it really didn't matter about the subject, but the composition and the execution of this painting is what created style.
When Degas saw the painting, he reportedly wrote to Cassat, "What design, what style."
Those 4 words displayed the mindset of Edgar Degas, clever enough to praise his own style through a compliment. But no mind the irony, it was a victory for Mary Cassatt. She had proved she was at the level of her colleague. She had found her place in this world of men.
Ironically, when he saw her paintings, he would say, I won't admit that a woman can paint like that, but if it was in his sarcastic way, he was kind of giving her a compliment. So it was a way that you could tell that he admired her a bit.
Degas liked the painting by Cassat so much that he exchanged it with her for one of his nudes. His personal collection was now 3 pastels and about 100 etchings signed by her. Mary Cassatt owned at least 15 paintings by Degas. Their love by painting was obvious. But did they love each other in real life?
The man who counted most in her life was obviously Degas, and I am sure that she admired him so much that at some point she was in love with him.
Could there be a possibility of a relationship? I don't think so. She was already risking her reputation being associated with the new independent artists and aligning herself with these radical impressionists. Had there been even one hint of inappropriate behavior, she wouldn't have been taken as seriously, and that was more important to her than any kind of a relationship she might have with Edgar Degas.
There is no written indication that the 2 artists might have had a love affair. They both remained very secretive about their private lives. And in his letters we still have, Degas surprisingly mentions little to nothing about the woman he saw almost every day and continued to call Mademoiselle Cassat.
Manet would gossip about Edgar Degas, and he would say, Degas is incapable of showing love. He would never even tell anyone that he did.
The problem is that we know that Mary Cassatt destroyed all her correspondence with Degas, and he left almost nothing. So apparently both were very careful to leave no trace of their ties.
So while the 2 artists were silent about their relationship, their paintings may have spoken for them. Degas often used Mary Cassatt as a model. At the fashion designers or the museum, she was the incarnation of the bourgeois woman, but not really Mary. Only one painting is a real portrait of her. Cassatt is sitting and holding playing cards in a rather unfeminine pose that was unconventional for a woman of her standing.
He was probably more fascinated with this woman and painter than he ever said. And that is what he showed us in this painting.
He paints her as a strong, bold woman. At one point, he writes that he elevated her to the stature of a man in this portrait because he applied the conventional male portraiture to the portrait that he did of her. She's leaning forward, her knees are slightly apart. She's even holding playing cards, which women weren't allowed to play cards at the time.
Degas meant to show she had the card game under control, and more than people might have thought. She could run things, including him.
Yet Degas seemed to be running the show when in 1879, at the height of their affinity, he got her involved in an adventure that left her exhausted.
Degas launched the idea of a magazine, Day and Night, to be essentially devoted to engravings. He requested the participation of Pissarro, an excellent engraver, Félix Bracquemond, and Mary Cassatt.
Together they began to put together the publication, which in the end became the Impressionist Review. And like all such projects, it demanded a lot of them from the beginning, and they realized a lot of work was involved.
Ludovic Halevi commented, "Oh, they're always tightly involved there, all of them. Mary Cassatt is there, working on the presses, in fact."
The work setting was very bold for that era. Mary Cassatt was working a heavy press in a dusty warehouse surrounded by men.
Mary Cassatt was a strong woman. She got the heavy machines turning. It was a way of expressing herself that I would say called for muscles and being in shape.
And then Degas abandoned them, like a coward, you might say. The others took it like that. He was criticized by some of the team for effectively doing things but not going all the way with the project.
So she knew that it wasn't constant and that it could change dramatically.
This was painful for Mary Cassatt, as she was extremely unhappy about the whole affair. I think it was the first time they got angry with each other, for a short time.
There was some damage done. It's very interesting that the admiration Mary Cassatt had felt for Degas was now broken, and this allowed her to develop her full artistic capacity, and she was able to free herself from this relationship.
After this first blow to their friendship, Mary Cassatt threw herself wholeheartedly into the practice of engraving and lithography. She even invented a technique whereby color could be directly applied to the copper plates before printing. At that moment, she began to paint maternity wards, a theme that would become her signature work. This was somewhat curious, as she herself had never had any children.
Mary Cassatt was subconsciously redirecting something that she had chosen not to live in her own life. In other words, there was a choice to make if she sought to be a female painter who succeeded in the 19th century. She could not be with her children during the day and be painting at night. It was a lifestyle choice, but we can feel that by painting these maternity wards, she was transferring something that she could have lived herself.
She resented this continued reference to her childless state. She never felt that it was a personal tragedy. She devoted her life to her art. She never felt that she made the wrong choice. She writes in a letter, "Nothing could have been further from the truth. I've enjoyed an immensely social and richly woven life, and I painted what I loved." She elevated that genre from the sentimental kind of anecdotal representation of women, but she represented it in a naturalistic gesture with her animated brushstroke, her bright tones. She captured compassion. She made the paintings more authentic.
The first observation is, try to find a woman who is smiling, and you cannot find any. They're all very serious. I think she wanted to show the importance of the woman in the education of children and the responsibility for that education.
The glorified image of the maternity ward could be linked to the growing pressure of feminism in the United States in the 19th century.
Her feminist views were very evident in the work that she did. Usually the women that she painted have children, which was a feminist ideal that she believed in, that women should take care of their own children and not have nursemaids. That was kind of the liberated woman at the time.
Concerning Degas, the link between his life and his paintings was more ambiguous. As an artist, he was often present at sensitive moments for women. But as a man, did he also share those moments? Degas was said to have been a lifelong bachelor, misogynist, sometimes even perverse or impotent.
The personal life of Degas was complicated and mysterious. In fact, it was more complicated than it was mysterious.
He was a very solitary man, and he decided, that he didn't need the company of others. It was probably more the fact that he lived with two widower grandfathers, bachelor uncles. There wasn't any inclination to marry. So he really didn't have an example, I think, of that.
He built a social character for himself that protected him with a hard shell, armor that meant, don't come near me. But at the same time, through his painting, he showed us another side of himself, more sensitive and also more sensual. This means that everything he lived and experienced, in fact, expressed itself through the prism of his creative capacity. But that said, it is interesting to examine his work with prostitutes. It does shed a bit of light, at least, on how he looked at women.
Degas had a straightforward connection with the working women whom he frequented regularly in the wings of the opera and the bordellos.
In fact, in his depiction of these women, there is absolutely nothing erotic that we can feel. There's nothing titillating in the nudes of Degas.
His silhouettes are generally large and rather aloof. Their faces are often only sketches or poorly visible, profiles masked by shadow effects. They depict a rather crude image, not flattering to the real scene.
He refused to make the women beautiful in his nudes. He puts them in these awkward poses. His models have kind of a brutal, cruel look. Some people described his nudes as looking more like a woman as an animal. But the raw reality was that he wanted to paint women undressing, not just a beautiful nude.
Marie Cassatt owned one of these nudes that had caused a scandal. She liked how Degas depicted the bodies of these women with no idealism. She still felt close to the artist, but no longer shared the ideas of the man. The breakup happened in 1897, the most important political affair of the end of the century that tore France apart for some 12 years, also put an end to their friendship.
The artistic relationship between Degas and Mary Cassatt lasted their whole lives, but their friendship, no.
The Dreyfus affair, I think, was one of the times that challenged their relationship. Dreyfus was the only Jew in the general staff of the French army, and he was falsely accused of betraying France by passing off military secrets to Germany. Now, most French intellectuals believed that he was innocent, and Degas did not. He turned his back on everyone because he tended to be very vocal about his anti-Semitic beliefs.
But quite the opposite, Mary Cassatt took the side of Dreyfus. From then on, Degas really closed up. The breakup isolated him heavily until the end of his life, from 1897 to 1917.
Louisine Havemeyer, a close part of their friendship, was very unhappy with this latest dispute. She said that Mary Cassatt understood Degas better than anyone. She tried to convince her to renew their friendship.
I was often amused during the many years I spent time with them because of the many dinners organized by their friends to reconcile them. I remember one of them in particular, in Paris. Mary Cassatt and Degas had quarreled over the Dreyfus affair. Miss Cassatt was confused about accepting to have lunch with Degas. For the love of God, accept, I said.
But the Dreyfus case, she replied, I know he's going to attack me.
Don't hesitate. Go ahead and make him shut up once and for all.
But my dear Louisine, she said, I'm running out of arguments. You don't have the slightest idea of how bad he can be, and he will say anything.
You too, I responded, and she accepted to go.
This affair tarnished their friendship forever. It left a shadow of anti-Semitism on Degas that is still there today. The beginning of the 20th century was for both artists a period marked by isolation and sickness. Degas developed a type of depression, and Mary Cassatt, out of touch with the young art scene, left Paris and went to live in her chateau of Beaufresne in the nearby Oise region.
Mary Cassatt was feeling threatened and very hostile about the new developments in Fauvism and modern art and Cubism, post-Impressionism. She felt that the art of the past was gone. She felt a crisis of creativity. Edgar Degas, despite the fact that he had huge international success at this point, there were high prices being paid for his works of art, he became indifferent to the glory. His fame, he said, was a burden to him, and he became more bitter as his eyesight worsened, as he lost his hearing, he became more reclusive. His untrimmed beard grew white and very long. He became very eccentric.
Following the Dreyfus affair, the two artists never saw each other again, but they continued to watch over each other from a distance. Though he was already very sick, Degas went to the Durand-Ruel house to see the exhibit of Mary Cassatt's pastels. She helped organize the end of his life by sending a nurse, her niece, to his bedside. Degas died on September 27, 1917, with some notice in the press. But Paris was focused on news from the war front. Mary Cassatt was devastated.
So she called his death a deliverance. She knew that he was in misery, and this was actually a gift. It was a relief that he wasn't suffering any longer. But she was very sad because she knew that he was one of the last great artists of the 19th century, and she said, I see no one else to replace him.
Mary Cassatt was very present at the death of Degas, and she still spoke of their friendship and shared moments.
And 9 years later, Marie Cassatt died in her Beaufresne chateau, leaving behind a collection of 600 paintings, 300 etchings, and the praise of her contemporaries. Since the early days with the group, she had drawn the attention of critics, including Émile Zola, widely read especially with the Dreyfus affair. He wrote of her inhabitual originality, but at her death, she was forgotten about in France, though she had spent the major part of her life here.
Art history has been deeply unfair to Mary Cassatt, as it has been to all female artists.
She was daring, and she had unconventional subject matter, used materials that had not been seen before, and yet she is never really elevated to the first tier of the Degas, Renoir, Monets in the Impressionist selection of artists.
Yet in 1915, 19 of her paintings were side by side with those of Degas for an exhibit on women organized by suffragette activists in New York. The bourgeois ladies were next to the prostitutes and laundrywomen. Marie Cassatt was the equal of Edgar Degas. Seeing all these paintings together excited the critics. What counted was the dialogue in the paintings of the two artists. Side by side, they wrote a unique page in the history of Impressionism, a human and intimate page.